My name's Joe Huxley, as David just said. I lead FSD Africa's Fragile States work, so hopefully we can have some conversations in the future about what we're doing and how we might partner together. But given recent sporting and political updates in the UK, I'm not going to talk very much over the next 90 minutes. And it's just as well because we have an excellent panel from the private sector here today. We've got two distinguished CEOs of West African banks, Groupe Banque Atlantique and Union Trust Bank in Sierra Leone. We've got a director of a private equity firm in the form of Emerging Capital Partners. And we also have a director of Mercy Corps, which is a Fragile States international organisation that also specialises in financial inclusion. The session, as David said, is about views and impressions from financial institutions, but also investors on their perspectives of what it's really like to do business in fragile states and fragile regions. Financial institutions, banks, MFIs and investors are really at the core of financial markets. They do the deals, they provide access to finance and access to capital, but they're also going to tell you about what the reality is like of doing business in fragile states over the next 90 minutes. So without further ado, I'm just going to explain very briefly to the panelists, to the audience, the structure of the session. So we're going to spend just a couple of minutes with each panelist introducing themselves, saying what their business does, who their clients are, and where they operate. And then we're going to go into the core of the session, which is about what the challenges are doing business in fragile states and fragile sub-regions, what makes it difficult to do business there. And then we're going to have some Q&A. I think each of the chunky sessions will last about 15-20 minutes each, and then we'll do some Q&A and I'll take some questions from the audience. The second chunky piece will be around, well, what's the opportunity of doing business in a fragile environment? And then I'll take some more Q&A. And then finally, I'm going to ask the panelists to describe what they need from policymakers and from donors to make doing business easier in fragile states. And then we'll wrap up and hopefully we'll have some coffee. In the unlikely event we'll take quicker than 90 minutes, we'll have a longer coffee break. But in the meantime, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Koroma to introduce himself and to introduce his bank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, delegates, may I say. My name is Sanka Koroma. I am from Sierra Leone, and I want to thank the organizers for having all of us here to share experiences. And this afternoon in particular, we're going to share our experiences and our views on the major subject of countries in fragile situations. Sierra Leone, as you may be aware, we've gone through a series of fragile situations. And I have been a principal player in almost all of them. I say so because during the Civil War, which we had, I became governor of the central bank just in the middle of the war, and I entered the central bank without a governor, without a deputy governor to hand over to me. I had almost all key players, department heads out of the country, and part of the central bank looted. So I had the responsibility of piecing it up all together, and it was not an easy time. I left the central bank after a couple of years, and thankfully, I think we were able to do a lot with the cooperation of a lot of the institutions that are here today. The other fragile situation that we had, which was most unexpected, the Ebola. I'm not a friend of Jeff Sachs, but I think he came very vividly in explaining the fragile situations in Africa. And the Ebola virus fits in so properly in that. We never expected that. And when that happened, I was running Union Trust Bank. Union Trust Bank I founded in 1994, it was 20 years last year. And when the Ebola struck, it was unprecedented, because unlike HIV/AIDS, unlike civil war, unlike everything else, this one was so devastating, so life-threatening, that the whole country, all three countries involved, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, were all just totally destroyed. Many people left the country. If you run an institution like Union Trust Bank, which I had about 12 branches all over the country, it was quite traumatic. So there are situations like that. And what do you do when things like that happen? First of all, you have to think about your staff. You have to think about what the central bank does for you, which is our regulator, our supervisor. But above all, what do you do with your money the people's money in your hands? You only think about your own funds, which you have given out on loans, after you're thinking about those people who, when the disease goes and the problem stops, they come knocking to the bank to say, where is my money? So these are the kinds of situations that we're talking about here. And fragility, as it's been defined in so many ways, comes in many forms. But to be in a situation like Ebola was really, really, really very difficult. And what do you expect? I suppose one of the reasons why we're here to dialogue with the donors is to see what we can expect from them, or what we have received from them during this crisis, and what experiences we can get from them. And for me, I listened to the government people, the ministers, talking this morning about their situations. And there was a central bank governor here who is also from Guinea. But most of the times when crises happen, very few people think about the private sector. The private sector. Everything is public. If it's a civil war, it's public. If it's Ebola, it's public. If it's HIV, it's public. Now, in the present situation that we have, we are just now looking at what to do after Ebola. In Sierra Leone, in particular, the president had an initial response, and there was a response team. And that response enterprise was led by donors. And I can tell you it was public sector led. Absolutely nothing for the private sector. Last week, Monday, the president, in a very national activity, launched the second phase of the delivery process after Ebola. Of all the speakers, from the donor agency, the World Bank, the IMF, African Development Bank, and all of these people went there. Who spoke for the private sector? The Minister of Trade. Not even a managing director from a bank, or not even a guy who's running his activity. The Minister of Trade spoke for the private sector. That shows you that all of these initiatives are public sector led. So where does the private sector come in? Who talks about delivering credit? Who talks about branches? Who talks about SMEs? And all of this is so important. It's so important if you are to revive an economy. Without financial institutions, you cannot do it. Without credit to the SMEs, you cannot do it. You can pump as much drugs as possible. You can bring in as much mosquito nets as you can, but without credit, without improving lives through financial intermediation, you cannot do it. So my view is the interventions of our development partners must change. And I was talking to one of my colleagues here about DFI, and I'm not anyway embarrassing defeat. But they have an initiative in Sierra Leone, and he was asking where that is launched. That is in the office of the president, not in a bank or in a private institution. So I think really this matters. This perception that everything that our development partners do is geared to or through the public sector, to the ministries, to the finance. If you take the ADB representative in Sierra Leone, I have for 5 years, I am not calling his name here, but I'm sure he's around here. He has never visited Union Trust Bank. And Union Trust Bank happens to be the only indigenous private bank in Sierra Leone of 12 banks. So that gives you an idea how the private sector is neglected. And in particular, delivering credit at all levels of the private sector really matters. And I think that should change now. And I hope after this, our colleagues in here, whether you are from DFID, whether you are from the African Development Bank, World Bank, let us think about the private sector and how we reach them. Only through that, effectively, can you reach the people down there who are the ultimate recipients of aid. I think I stopped there.
Thanks, Dr. Gomez. We'll have plenty of time to talk about challenges and opportunities. So, Bryce, if you could just introduce yourself quite quickly, and then we'll move along the panel. But refocusing back on the private sector and not losing sight of who can really deliver job creation and resilience is really important.
Hello everyone, my name is Bryce Lotunion. I work for Emerging Capital Partners, a private equity firm, exclusively focused in Africa, with over $2 billion USD under management. We are Pan-African fund investors. We pride ourselves in having invested in over 40 countries, which includes the usual suspect, but also lesser perceived attractive countries. In the financial services space, we are the leading investor in Ora Bank, a banking group active in West and Central Africa, which is covering the entire YMU zones. And also we are the leading investor in FINADEV, which is a microfinance institution active in Chad, Benin and Guinea. We were active in countries such as Liberia, Guinea, Chad, which has gone through several crises, and I'd like to share my perspective later on.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, I prefer speaking in French. Ok, je suis le directeur général de Atlantic Business International, et la holding financière de contrôle et de développement des entités Banque Atlantique installées dans tous les pays de l'UEMOA. Nous sommes en train de créer en fait la succursale de Guinée-Bissau, je pense qui est un pays fragile. Donc je pense que normalement en juillet prochain, nos activités devraient démarrer en Guinée-Bissau. Ce qu'il faut également indiquer, c'est que la Banque Atlantique a été désignée en mai dernier, en marge de l'Assemblée annuelle de la BAD à Lusaka, comme la meilleure banque de l'Afrique de l'Ouest par rapport à des opérations structurantes qu'elle a pu faire au niveau de notre marché. C'est un effectif d'environ 2000 employés dans tous ces pays. Et également, lorsqu'on regarde un peu le rapport de la Commission bancaire 2014, c'est le troisième groupe bancaire de l'Union, avec environ 5 milliards de dollars de total bilan et environ 600 000 comptes bancaires. Voilà, donc pour ce qui concerne le sujet, peut-être qu'on va rentrer dans les détails tout à l'heure. Je pense qu'on a eu à vivre une expérience inédite, notamment en Côte d'Ivoire, avec la crise post-électorale. Tout à l'heure, on pourra rentrer dans les détails. Également, il y a eu des difficultés, je crois, au niveau du Mali. Je constate que le président de l'APB du Mali, mon collègue Mousta Diallo est dans la salle. Donc, par ailleurs, je suis président de l'Association des banques en Côte d'Ivoire et de la zone UMOA. Donc, tout à l'heure, je pense qu'on pourra rentrer dans les détails pour qu'on puisse relater en fait notre expérience par rapport aux crises que ces différents pays ont connues. Et également, il y a eu le cas du Burkina Faso. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Diasuba. Thea, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Thea Anderson with Mercy Corps. I'm our Director for Financial Inclusion. Hopefully some of you know Mercy Corps. We work in 42 countries around the world, including 16 countries here in sub-Saharan Africa. And we tend to focus on fragile and conflict states, and a lot of focusing more and more on countries that are really transitioning out of conflict, so really mirroring a lot of what's happened in earlier discussions today. We use a market systems approach when we look at financial services, often acting as a market facilitator ourselves or supporting other market facilitators. As part of my role, I spent a lot of my time with different financial institutions, and I would say more and more, increasingly with different technology providers. Again, kind of mirroring what we've heard today, so it's nice to see that that's a trend. We right now in Mercy Corps, we have a partnership with Financial Sector Deepening Africa that's focused on their research agenda on financial sector development. We are helping them think through how to use a market systems approach when doing financial sector development in fragile and conflict states. We're asking several questions, and one is really around what does make financial sector development different or unique. And most importantly, kind of going back to some of the earlier panel comments already about what have donors learned so far about what they could and should be doing moving forward. As part of this research, we're looking into several different themes. One is around different delivery channels that really donors can be using to support the private sector. One is looking at payments infrastructure, specifically around accelerating the use of mobile money and around remittances. So not just the products themselves, but that infrastructure that needs to be in place. Two is the use of different insurance products as well as liquidity funds. And three is different blended finance structures that can hopefully lead to stronger impact investments in fragile and conflict states. Looking at different market segments and clients is a strong focus on increased need for Islamic finance, as well as a focus on refugees and IDPs as a potential market segment. And then echoing back to the last panel is really looking at different successes and adapted regulatory approaches. So the use of functional IDs for large parts of the population that don't have IDs, consumer recourse, and tiered KYC. So I'm excited to be joining this panel and also understanding that as an implementer working closely with donors, how we can work better with the private sector.
Thanks, Thea. So we've got a range of financing institutions and investors, and also a research firm and practitioner on the panel. And I think we started to get into this, but let's focus on the challenges of the different types of fragile situations you've found in the markets in which you work over the next 15 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A from the audience. So can I hand over to you, Doctor, first? You started to talk about it, but we'd love to hear more about how your bank responded to the difficulties in Sierra Leone.
Well, we talk about challenges. I think after every crisis, one needs to look at the process of coming back to life, as it were. If you faced a crisis like Ebola, which is more devastating than any other civil war, if you're fighting rebels, they are not, they don't infect you when you meet them. You have malaria, it's not infectious. But Ebola, people run away from you. And you travel internationally, they don't even want to give you a visa. So that's the intensity of the crisis that we faced. As we say, even in your own home, you're afraid to come near your spouse. That's Ebola. So how do you try to cope back, to cope with these situations when the crisis eases? First, you have to bring your operations back online. That's difficult. Because of Ebola in Sierra Leone, for instance, all the commercial banks had to cut their working hours, and in some parts of the country, close up completely. That means you carry a weight bill, but without earning money. Now, because of Ebola, your NPL goes so high because a lot of those people who took money from the banks have either been displaced, they've gone away, or they died. Now, these are serious challenges. Serious challenges. And when we talk about access to finance, we talk really about availability, not only access to your local bank, access to the SME agent out there, but also the institutional access. Union Trust Bank needed money, needed access to development assistance, to technical assistance, financial assistance, and that's the problem. If you are a private indigenous bank, very few donors talk to you, because most of the time they look at regional banks. They are big. Now, how do you cope with that? And up until now, we're finding it extremely difficult to cope with that situation. You write projects as much as you can do, and it's expensive. If you were to engage IFC, you have to pay for the appraisals. You put money first before the IFC can come to you. If you have to approach a development finance institution, some of them take 2 years to put a project together. So these are the serious challenges of access to finance. And yet, when those people recover, when these families recover wherever they are, in remote parts of the country, those who are selling, who are petty traders and all of that, they need funds, and they come to you. Union Trust Bank has an SME subsidiary. That's just SME, and they are also spread all over the country. So with our meager resources, we have to fund them to reach other people. And really accessing funds through the institutional financing mechanisms is extremely difficult. And for governments, you better forget it. Because when they get funds, and I can tell you governments everywhere get funds, because the donors love governments. They love governments. They love to talk to the ministers. They love to go to a country and go to State House and talk to the president. So their reports are glossy. We visited the president. They don't want to know you visited Union Trust Bank. Nobody wants to know about that. I visited State House. I will talk to the Minister of Finance. So these are the obstacles that we face. So they leave talking to you. You spend money taking them out for lunch. You spend money preparing projects. But at the end of the day, they turn back to say, look, we are reorganizing inwards, we are doing that, and the process goes on. So really for me the key issue here about whether it's women finance, whether it's project finance, whether all sorts of finance is accessibility. Our development partners must reach down there. I'll give you another example. Government again. We have in Sierra Leone the Ministry of Trade. And I was talking to the Minister of Finance. I said the Minister of Trade has more money than the Minister of Finance. Whether it's EIB, whether it's ILO, and all of these institutions give money to the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Agriculture, to deliver credit, which they are not trained to do, which they cannot do, but they have to sit on so much money, and they don't have any balance sheets, they don't have annual accounts. For those who are structured like banks, commercial banks, that have annual reports, that have annual accounts, that are regulated by the central bank, and they just cannot access it. So again, accessibility is the problem. And I think our development partners must change the narrative, must change their style, and look more deeply into where credit is needed, where funding is needed, where assistance is needed, because it is only the private sector, government agencies, civil servants cannot deliver credit. They don't know how to do it. They are not taught to do that. Commercial banks are taught to do that. That's their job, and they should channel credit and resources to these institutions to really make an impact in development.
Right. You invest in over 40 countries in Africa. What's been your experience of fragility? How's it affected your firm?
I guess we are fortunate to look at Africa as a collection of countries, but when we look in particular to those countries, we try to incorporate them in a broader region or platform so that they can have some sort of solidarity between the same entity. That is to say, for instance, in our banking platform, there are countries such as Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, Chad, but also there are smaller countries such as Niger, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and we're able to reallocate the capital across the weaker country from the stronger country to sort of help the more fragile operation. Obviously, we haven't seen a lot of local support from the authority of the regulatory body in the country where we operated. So we have to only count on our management teams, staff on the ground. We've gone through some really difficult times, say in Chad, after the crisis related to Boko Haram. The state has been in much more difficult situation. And then in our operation, we're suffering a lot, but we're trying to cope with that, trying to raise money from the outside and put up more resources into that subsidiary, because we continue to believe in that country. In Liberia, for instance, we fortunately were able to exit a mobile operation which we had in our portfolio. It happened earlier this year. Obviously, it was difficult for us because the mobile operator was called Celcom. It used to run very well. And then due to the situation, it was difficult to get investors to even come over in Monrovia to conduct due diligence. You have to buy something, so you have to get people to come over and see what is it that they are buying. If they are too scared about what is the health condition in that country, then obviously it's difficult to conduct any sort of transaction. But we there again were able to get out in fairly attractive conditions. So I'd say we're still confident that over time we see opportunity rather than fly away from those countries. Obviously, we have to reorganize ourselves because those are more challenging locations for us. But we're not giving up.
Thank you, Mr. Diarra Souda. How have you encountered fragility in your business?
Ok, je vous remercie. Je vais commencer par l'exemple de la Côte d'Ivoire, qui a connu une situation particulière, comme vous le savez, de décembre 2010 à avril 2011. Nous étions dans une situation inédite, notamment sur la Côte d'Ivoire, parce que durant cette période, le système bancaire était livré à lui-même et face à deux gouvernements. Nous avions un gouvernement qui était sur le plateau, on dira, sur Abidjan, et un autre gouvernement qui était isolé au niveau du Golfe. Et nous avions à faire face en fait à la mise en œuvre de certaines mesures de la Banque centrale. Comme vous le savez, pour ceux qui ne le savent pas, au niveau de l'UEMOA, nous avons une seule banque centrale en fait qui régule les activités au niveau des 8 pays et qui avait pris certaines décisions concernant la Côte d'Ivoire. Et la mise en application n'était pas évidente, compte tenu du fait que la Banque centrale avait pris une position, mais les banquiers, en fait, dans les faits, avaient en face d'eux, en fait, le régime qui n'était pas reconnu par la Banque centrale. Donc il y a eu beaucoup d'activités en termes de nationalisation déjà de l'agence principale de la Banque centrale et également de nationalisation de certaines banques, dont la filiale de la BNP et de la Société Générale. Et ça crée vraiment au niveau des banquiers une psychose. Donc, le premier défi, en fait, c'est vrai que c'était la protection des actifs par rapport aux installations, mais il y avait également la problématique de la sécurité physique même des personnes. Parce que voilà, il était interdit aux banquiers même de sortir de la Côte d'Ivoire. Donc c'était une situation difficile. Aujourd'hui, on en parle peut-être avec plus de sérénité, mais c'était une situation vraiment difficile. Donc, nous avons eu à gérer cette situation comme on le pouvait, en sauvegardant notamment les fonds des clients, parce que, comme vous le savez, dans nos différents pays, c'est la monnaie fiduciaire, c'est-à-dire le cash, qui est beaucoup utilisé par les populations. Donc, nous avons des agences un peu partout sur la Côte d'Ivoire. Il fallait rapatrier par des moyens bien spécifiques tous ces fonds-là, je veux dire, sur Abidjan, et puis pouvoir les stocker dans des endroits autres que la Banque centrale, parce que l'agence de la Banque centrale était occupée par d'autres autorités non reconnues par la Banque centrale de Dakar. Donc c'était une situation quand même spéciale. Donc on a géré autant qu'on pouvait cette situation, le temps que la crise puisse être réglée. Et lorsque nous sommes revenus, c'est-à-dire après le 11 avril, nous avons constaté une situation de dégradation avancée de nos installations, notamment les agences bancaires, les distributeurs automatiques de biens. Et nous avons constaté également que la plupart de nos clients, notamment les PME, étaient dans des situations très très difficiles parce que ce sont des gens qui avaient contracté pour la plupart au niveau de la commande publique et ils avaient des difficultés parce que pendant toute cette période-là, ils n'avaient pas d'interlocuteur pour régler les différentes créances. Donc ce genre de situation d'instabilité ou bien d'insécurité politique a mécaniquement un impact sur l'intégrité physique des banquiers, sur nos installations et également sur la qualité du portefeuille crédit. Parce qu'il y a une hausse du risque en fait lié au portefeuille crédit. Et dans les faits, en fait, on a constaté que l'impact sur nos portefeuilles de crédit, malheureusement, pendant cette période, n'ont pas été pris en compte par les régulateurs par rapport à une situation exceptionnelle qui n'était pas de notre fait. Donc il fallait appliquer, malgré cette situation, le dispositif réglementaire en matière de constatation des créances saines en créances en souffrance et également constituer les provisions également qu'il fallait. On n'a pas eu de mesures d'accompagnement. Deuxièmement, nous avons un secteur privé qui est très organisé au niveau de la Côte d'Ivoire à travers la Confédération Générale des Entreprises de Côte d'Ivoire et également l'association des banques que je préside en Côte d'Ivoire. Nous avons eu à élaborer tout un cahier, un document, avec en recensant en fait toutes nos pertes au niveau physique et au niveau du portefeuille qui, dans le temps, ont été soumis aux autorités. Ça concerne, c'est vrai, le secteur bancaire, mais ça concerne également d'autres secteurs. Mais également à ce niveau, il n'y a pas eu de réponse concrète. Il y a eu, c'est vrai, quelques mesures fiscales d'accompagnement des PME ici et là, mais il n'y a pas eu de mesures concrètes pour nous permettre, en fait, de pouvoir supporter la perte qu'on a subie du fait de cette crise. Vous comprenez ? Mais malgré cette situation, je veux dire, quand le gouvernement s'est mis au travail, le gouvernement a élaboré un plan stratégique de 2011 à 2015 et s'est beaucoup appuyé sur le secteur privé, donc sur les banques en fait, pour pouvoir mettre en œuvre ce projet-là. Et le gouvernement a également créé un cadre de concertation, secteur public, secteur privé, dans lequel en fait les banques soumettaient leurs problèmes et le secteur privé soumettait leurs problèmes pour pouvoir accompagner le gouvernement. Donc de telle sorte que les banques en fait qui étaient en difficulté du fait de cette situation ont injecté leurs actionnaires des nouveaux capitaux dans leur balance sheet pour pouvoir avoir un niveau de fonds propres important pour pouvoir accompagner la dynamique économique. Et je pense que lorsqu'on regarde les résultats à fin 2015, les résultats sont satisfaisants, notamment par rapport à la contribution des banques au financement de l'économie. Parce que les principaux indicateurs, lorsqu'on regarde le ratio financement de l'économie comparé au PIB, on est passé de 16% en 2011 à environ 23% en 2015. Donc on a gagné 6 à 7 points, je veux dire, durant les 4 dernières années. Et on essaie de se mettre en fait dans ces dispositions-là. Voilà. Donc, je pense que pour pouvoir encourager les banques à faire plus, notamment par rapport à la promotion de la financiarisation et également à la préservation de leurs fondamentaux, il est bon que les bailleurs de fonds puissent intégrer ces aspects-là. Je veux dire par rapport à des soutiens qui peuvent être apportés aux banques commerciales. Parce que lorsqu'il y a des crises comme ça, elles ont besoin d'avoir des soutiens pour leur permettre en fait de poursuivre leur mission de financement en fait aux économies. Il y a le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, on a eu également le cas du Mali, lorsque on a eu en fait les terroristes qui ont occupé une partie du nord du Mali. Ça a amené également les banquiers, l'APB au niveau du Mali, à se mettre ensemble, à affréter avec l'appui de la Banque centrale un avion pour pouvoir rapatrier les fonds du nord vers le sud en fait. Donc tout ça dans une situation qui est aujourd'hui difficile et qui nous pose par moments dans le cadre de nos activités des problèmes même liés à la conformité par rapport à tout ce qui concerne la mise en œuvre, le suivi de la lutte contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement des terrorismes en fait. Donc je pense que ce sont des défis importants auxquels nous faisons face en fait. Donc il est bon que dans les réflexions, vraiment, cet aspect-là par rapport à tout soutien qui peut être apporté aux établissements bancaires soit vraiment pris en compte. Parce que, comme on l'a dit depuis le matin, il y a une corrélation positive entre l'approfondissement du secteur financier et l'amélioration des conditions de vie des populations. Voilà. Notre taux de bancarisation dans nos zones, malgré tous les efforts qui sont faits, reste encore faible. On est à 7-8%. C'est vrai que lorsqu'on intègre le mobile money, on est au-delà de 20%. Mais l'idée, il faut aller plus loin que ça. Pour que toutes ces transactions qui se font, pour qu'on puisse avoir les ressources longues qu'il faut pour financer durablement nos économies. Et lorsqu'on parle encore de défis, il y a un défi dont on ne parle pas trop. Bon, Ebola, c'est un point que nous partageons pour ce qui concerne la Côte d'Ivoire. C'est vrai que les mesures ont été prises pour préserver le pays d'Ebola, mais c'est un phénomène dont nous tenons compte dans nos différents scénarios lorsqu'on établit nos plans à moyen terme, je veux dire au niveau de nos établissements. Mais on a également aujourd'hui la grippe aviaire, c'est-à-dire la grippe aviaire au niveau des volailles. Aujourd'hui, depuis plusieurs mois, il est interdit d'exporter de la volaille du Burkina Faso en Côte d'Ivoire. Parce qu'il y a une crise qui sévit, donc qui mécaniquement a un impact également sur les différentes activités des banques et des populations. Voilà, donc voici un peu quelques éléments de réflexion que j'avais souhaité exposer et indiquer que le soutien des banques à travers les guichets des donateurs doit être plus accessible et avoir plus de flexibilité, avoir moins de critères contraignants pour que les banques commerciales puissent avoir les moyens de financer durablement nos économies. Parce qu'on n'a pas d'autre choix que de développer nos pays. Comme je vous l'ai indiqué, nous avons une vision de regarder un verre à moitié plein et non un verre à moitié vide en fait. Parce qu'on se dit qu'il y a du potentiel, on se dit qu'il y a de l'espoir. Raison pour laquelle, malgré la fragilité d'un pays comme la Guinée-Bissau, on décide d'y investir. Parce qu'on se dit que c'est un pays où il y a du potentiel, en tout en espérant que la stabilité politique puisse voir le jour en fait. Voilà, donc voici un peu l'état d'esprit dans lequel nous sommes. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. There's a lot in there. Thea, do you have anything to add before we go to the audience for 3 questions?
Sure. You guys have already covered quite a bit, so I can be quick. But as Mercy Corps, we're practitioners. We really, our role is basically between the donors and in between different private sector actors. So when we work in a fragile state or in a country in transition, what we often look at is 3 different areas. One is the overall market system, and then also looking at different consumer demand as well as the supply. I think you guys have covered quite a bit, but one thing I just want to point out is one of the things that we find quite a bit, especially in more fragile areas, is that when the private sector, as you've mentioned, are still functional and still active during a crisis, even though a lot of the transactions tend to be more informal. But the other thing that we see more and more is that there's high levels of market distortion, both from development and a lot of times directly from humanitarian aid, especially in active conflicts, as well as in crisis situations, as we're talking about with the Ebola, which quite honestly can create a second disaster if that market, if the humanitarian aid is taking away potential clients from a private sector actor. And we see that a lot, especially with commercial microfinance. If a lot of business grants, huge numbers of business grants are given out during a crisis, then as you've mentioned before, the non-performing loan portfolio goes up. There's not such a high demand for credit, and then when the humanitarian aid is pulled out, then the financial institutions aren't able to perform anymore. So that's something we see over and over again. The other thing I would say, just from consumer side, is that people tend to be more risk averse as well, and tend to invest less, or when they do, it tends to be in very low risk activities. And just a lot of focus more on informal savings and informal borrowing, especially from building on different social and business networks. And one thing we found as well is that there does seem to be a higher usage of the mobile money, though it's so country specific. You know, in Somalia it tends to be higher, but in Central African Republic or where that payment infrastructure is not in place, it tends to be very low. So I think sometimes those numbers can be a bit misleading. One of the things we also see, especially when we're talking about a very active crisis, is that from the consumer perspective, is that's when people turn to really try to focus on stretching the current income that they have, so that not only individuals but also businesses aren't pushed into deeper debt, aren't having to resort to negative coping mechanisms like, you know, shedding assets or limited food intake. And it's not until a more latent conflict or the crisis is beginning to subside that people can start really thinking about diversifying their income streams. And it's not really till more post-conflict where there's an opportunity again for different increasing incomes. And I think that has a huge impact on what products are appropriate and for who. And then just from, you know, having the opportunity to work so much with different banks, what we also find especially is really that, as one of my panelists already mentioned, is really that lack of liquidity. During the crisis is when people want to withdraw their savings. The NPL also, that's when it increases, and that's also when the credit demand is highest. And you know, we do quite a bit of liquidity funds in post-industrial disaster, and there's a lot of opportunities within fragile and conflict states to have similar funds as well.
Thanks. Just as we're warming up questions, just a few highlights. So we heard from the panel about instability and fragility in Mali, Sierra Leone, Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria. We heard about different types of fragility. We talked about epidemics and the impact of epidemics and Ebola, political instability and conflict. From our investor and private equity fund, we heard that even doing due diligence is difficult because people can't enter the country and assess firms. And finding co-investors whenever you're trying to co-invest is difficult because of travel. We also mentioned the issue of visas. It's difficult to get visas sometimes. It's as operational as that. From the banks, we heard that sometimes a slight lack of flexibility from regulatory bodies can be difficult and constraining. We also heard that the quality of the portfolio can decline dramatically during fragility. NPLs rise quite acutely because people have been displaced or killed. Also, the diversity of activities banks carry out can diminish because activities like trade finance might be put on hold. And we also heard about banks' assets, so protecting its people, buildings, making sure that funds are repatriated safely, ATMs are looked after well. That was also a big challenge. But over to the audience. Who has any questions for our panelists? We'll take 3 in a group, and then the panelists can choose which they'd like to answer.
Lorsqu'on parle de crises comme celle de la grippe aviaire, par exemple, quel pourrait être le rôle de l'assurance? On n'a pas parlé effectivement des produits d'assurance et comment le secteur de l'assurance peut contribuer aussi à atténuer ou à accompagner en tout cas ce type de risque. Donc je serais intéressée à entendre les panélistes sur le sujet. Et le deuxième point, c'est par rapport à ce que disait Monsieur Dera-Souba, où il disait que le secteur bancaire serait intéressé à pouvoir bénéficier de conditions plus souples. pour pouvoir mieux contribuer au développement de l'économie. Donc j'aimerais qu'il puisse élaborer un peu plus. Est-ce que c'est par rapport au respect de certains ratios prudentiels, ou est-ce que c'est par rapport, par exemple, aux conditions d'identification des populations, ou aux exigences en matière d'identification qui peuvent exclure une partie de la population et donc limiter en fait l'accès de cette population à des services financiers que pourraient offrir les banques? Merci.
Thank you. Let's take another question, another 2 questions if there's another before we go back to the panel. I think the gentleman in the middle would like to ask something, and then we'll move to you, sir.
Olive Microfinance Bank, Nigeria. My question goes to Mr. Joseph Koroma, who was playing in UTB to those at the lowest ebb of the pyramid. My question to him is how he was able to assess the identity, conduct KYC of those people who are the base of the pyramid, because most of them don't have means of identification, and how he has been able to make recovery of the monies he lent to them. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just repeat the question for the translators. So that was a question about people at the bottom of the pyramid during fragile periods, and how to identify them through KYC protocols, and how do you actually go about recovering loans from people that are in default. I think we had one more question. Sir, did you have a question? And then we'll go back to the panel.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais intervenir par rapport à ce débat et dire à M. Koroma qu'il a parfaitement raison. Dans toutes les stratégies qui sont élaborées dans nos différents pays, on parlera toujours des cadres de concertation entre les secteurs publics et les secteurs privés, dans le renforcement du marché financier ou du dispositif. Mais en réalité, le public ne fait pas confiance au privé. Et dans notre zone, le secteur public considère même le secteur privé comme étant un concurrent. Dans toutes les stratégies, dans toutes les politiques de développement économique, vous allez voir qu'on va dire que le secteur privé est le moteur de la croissance. Mais c'est un slogan. Il faut en donner un contenu, ce Koroma. Et pour en donner un contenu, il faudra qu'il appartient en ce moment au secteur privé de s'organiser pour avoir une capacité d'analyse, mais aussi une capacité de proposition par rapport au public. Tant que le secteur privé ne s'organise pas pour constituer une force de proposition par rapport au secteur public, il est évident que toutes les stratégies de développement s'effèrent entre les bailleurs de fonds et le secteur administratif et public.
Okay, so a comment about fragmentation and the lack of cooperation between private and public sectors, slowing things down. So 3 questions there. One's about what is the role of insurance protecting businesses and people during fragile episodes. There was another question about what you specifically meant about the flexibility of regulatory regimes and protocols. What would you like to see in place? What's specifically very difficult to deal with during fragility? And then there was a final question about the role of KYC and recovering loans that have gone bad. So let's go firstly to Dr. Koroma on that question of KYC and loans and NPLs rising and recovery.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Let me address the question, the latter part of the question, where it said the private sector, whether we are lacking in confidence, whether it's just slogan, whether it's reality. Now, I have to be careful here because there's a representative of my regulator is here from Central Bank. So.
Put your fingers in your ears.
But the question of whether the private sector a reality or a slogan does not arise. The private sector is a reality. The public sector is given. Government has a role, whether it is education, whether it is selling cocoa or coffee, whatever it is, government has a role. But private sector is selective. It's selective because if you are engaged in a provision of a particular service on a commercial basis, you are not there to give handouts. Finance is reality. Each and every one of us need finance. The government sector is more of propaganda. It's the other way around. Private sector is reality. The government sector that can tell you where we're going to provide hospitals in this place, medicines. You go there 1 year later, there'll be no school, or there'll be no hospital, there'll be no drugs. But if a private sector operates in a particular area, say, I'm going to put a business here, it will be reality as long as it's worth its while. And that's the difference. So it's not a matter of slogan. If I'm putting a branch 400 or 300 kilometers away from the city, it has to be there. A branch has to be there. I have to take funds there. I have to ensure that I have staff there. If it is communication satellite, I have to make sure that there is communication there because banking is real time now. So it's not a matter of slogan. You have to put a branch in a certain place, however remote, it is a branch is a branch. You have to operate there. And you have to provide all that is required there. And I tell you, my brother, it's expensive. If you have to operate in a remote area, you provide electricity for yourself, water supply services, communication, and I tell people all the time, communication is one of our most expensive commodity in banking today. No matter where you are, if you have to provide banking services on a real-time basis, you have to. Nobody has talked about remittances here. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you a little bit about remittances and the problems. Now, when you have a crisis which is countrywide, you operate a service like Western Union. Union Trust Bank happens to be one of the first banks in Africa that had Western Union. We were like Western Union in Africa 20 years last year. And we operate almost everywhere in Sierra Leone. That money comes, you have to deliver it. It's not slogan. Now there's telephones. There are people in the rural areas who put on their telephone, their SIM card, only to talk to their children in America or in wherever part of the world to know whether they have sent that $100. You have to deliver it there. And that takes communication. Now, so it's not a matter of slogan, not a matter of suspicions. Government is different. Government can make promises. And they can come only after the 5 years when they have to go on another election, they come. They say, well, we did provide so and so. But for private enterprise, for delivery of financial services is reality. And it's no slogan, no politics about it. If you can't provide it, you can't provide it. So you better shut up and go away. So let's forget about being a slogan. It's a reality. And it's a very, very effective means. People have to leave. People have to send their children to school. And all of these things, you have to deliver it. You have to deliver the funds to them. If you have to deliver credit, you have to deliver credit. So it's a reality. And therefore, we are there to provide an essential service on a real-time basis. Delivering remittances, somebody sat here this morning and talks about how much remittances mean to Africa. And particularly in times of crisis. When there's a national crisis, you have to operate. Because that's the only, for some people out there, that's their only livelihood. For the $100, $200 coming from their children or their relatives or their spouses abroad. So that's reality.
How did you, on remittances, deal with KYC? We
have to. We have to deal with the KYC. SME lending is difficult. It's not like I'm lending to a manufacturer in Freetown. I know his premises, I know his residence, I have his track record, his banking. Lending out to SMEs is a different kettle of fish. You have to know your situation. And most of all, there is no collateral. There is hardly any collateral. But that's changing. And it depends also on the customs, the cultural traits. You know, when people talk about microfinance, working in East Asia, in India, in Bangladesh, is successful, that's the culture there, is to pay loans. There are certain countries or cultures in our region and sub-region where payment of debts, nobody wants to pay any debt. They will take that, they will not pay. That's a big problem, a big problem. And therefore, if you are involved in SMEs, which is largely uncollateralized, then you really have a problem. And that's why the NPL is so high. So you find other ways, like group lending, like setting up situations where the local chief will guarantee some people. And that's not even 100%. But it's only a process. And if you have to provide the service, so be it. You have to provide the service with all the risks that go with it. And you can live with them for a while until you have a real crisis when, if it becomes intolerable, then you leave. So KYC, yes, that's in modern banking, in the cities and in the farms, the manufacturers. But KYC down there is very, very little. Therefore, most of SME today is moving into group lending, where you have a group of women. And we lend a lot to groups of women. And you buy a cold room for them, or you buy a cold vehicle that transports their fish, or that transports their vegetables, and you take that as a collateral. And even that has to be serviced. So it's risky. And that is why if there is anything like soft funds that they give to government, it ought to go to the private sector, and particularly to those of us who deliver credit at the very remote areas of our countries.
Thank you. Mr. Diarasuba, I wondered if you could pick up the question on the specific regulations you found difficult at time of crisis.
Sur ce point, peut-être concernant la problématique déjà de l'assurance, hein, je vais dire que Corinne avait évoqué. Ce qu'il faut savoir déjà, c'est que dans nos pays, le taux de pénétration de l'assurance est très faible. On est à moins de 2%. Donc, c'est vrai que ce qui est recommandé, c'est que dans les pays, il est bon de sensibiliser les populations à aller vers l'assurance, aussi bien au niveau du secteur avicole que des autres secteurs d'activité, hein, dans les marchés et autres. Parce que il y a toujours des drames qu'on constate lorsqu'il y a des incendies de marché, ce qui est courant dans nos pays. Donc, je pense qu'au niveau du secteur d'assurance, il faut renforcer la promotion. Et lorsqu'on regarde également, les conditions d'accès à cette activité également sont élevées. Parce que par le passé, pour une compagnie d'assurance, pour le capital, il fallait 1 milliard. Mais il y a quelques semaines, il y a eu des décisions au niveau de la zone CIMA, voilà, qui décident que pour les compagnies d'assurance, il faut passer à 5 milliards. Donc, donc les conditions d'exercice de ces activités seront encore plus difficiles. Voilà, donc c'est quelque chose qu'il faut savoir, et ça va amener encore des gros joueurs, hein, à être présents dans notre zone, alors que vous savez, pour qu'il y ait l'inclusion, pour que la croissance puisse être partagée, il faut qu'on ait des sociétés, des institutions où sont présents des apporteurs de capitaux étrangers et des actionnaires locaux ou des actionnaires nationaux. Et ça a une chance en fait d'avoir l'inclusion, enfin, d'avoir une croissance inclusive et durable. Parce que quand l'entité est exclusivement détenue par un actionnaire étranger, lorsqu'il y a une difficulté, le réflexe tout de suite, c'est de délocaliser l'activité. Voilà, donc c'est quelque chose dont il faut tenir compte. D'accord. Pour revenir à ce qui concerne la réglementation, c'est vrai que nous évoluons dans une zone où il y a des avancées qui sont faites. Il y a eu pas mal de mesures prises par la Banque centrale pour rendre plus accessibles les services bancaires aux populations. Il y a seulement 1 an qu'il y a eu une décision importante qui a été prise où la Banque centrale, dans le cadre d'une concertation avec la profession bancaire au niveau de l'UMOA, a décidé en fait de supprimer des frais concernant 19 services bancaires qui sont devenus gratuits. Voilà, au niveau de l'Union pour rendre accessible en fait les services bancaires. Et il y a pas mal d'autres projets, d'accord, pour permettre aux banques de mieux mener leurs activités. Parce que je profite pour saluer Corinne, Enrique, qui fait un travail formidable pour l'amélioration de l'inclusion financière à travers la promotion en fait des services financiers numériques. Voilà. Et sur ce point également, la Banque centrale a créé un cadre réglementaire avec les établissements de monnaie électronique également qui travaillent aux côtés des banques pour la promotion en fait de l'inclusion financière. Voilà, donc ce sont des éléments qui sont importants, à savoir comme quoi il y a des évolutions au niveau des tests en fait pour nous permettre de mieux mener nos activités. Ce qu'il faut noter par rapport à tout ça, compte tenu des exigences de notre métier, il y a aussi un dispositif prudentiel qui est aussi rigide, qui est opposé aux banques, notamment il y a un ratio dont on parle qui est le ratio de transformation, qui est le ratio entre les ressources longues et les emplois longs, qui constitue, dont la norme est de 50%, souvent constitue une difficulté pour les banques parce que lorsqu'on regarde en fait les dépôts des banques, à 80% dans l'Union, ce sont des dépôts à vue en fait. Ce ne sont pas des dépôts longs. Voilà, donc tout ceci peut limiter les banques dans leur capacité de transformation. Raison pour laquelle nous croyons, sinon moi je crois en tout cas à un approfondissement du marché financier qui est d'avoir un écosystème où cohabitent les banques commerciales, les SFD, les établissements de monnaie électronique et un marché financier qui est dynamique et profond. Donc ceci devra amener en fait le régulateur du marché financier, c'est-à-dire le conseil régional de l'épargne et des marchés publics, à plus d'efficacité dans la promotion et dans l'approfondissement du marché financier à travers des réformes qu'on attend. Parce que lorsqu'on regarde qu'on veut créer des fonds communs de placement, des fonds d'investissement, lorsqu'on regarde la procédure, c'est un peu long et c'est un peu fastidieux. Donc, il est bon que tout ça soit revu. Voilà. Et lorsque on décide d'être en relation avec des structures comme la Banque africaine, comme la SFI, il faut reconnaître que les procédures sont longues et fastidieuses, avec une documentation souvent qui est kilométrique et de nature à ne pas encourager souvent les institutions à aller soit au guichet de la SFI ou de la Banque africaine de développement. Donc je pense que ce sont des choses qu'il faut revoir, qu'il faut faciliter pour que en fait l'accès à ces ressources longues-là ou bien à des lignes de garantie, d'accord, pour couvrir certains risques, soit plus accessible et nous permettre d'aller de l'avant.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, but Thea, do you have any reactions to what you've heard or any additions, particularly around insurance and non-performing loans? I don't think we quite bottomed out. From your experience of banks, do they write them off or do they extend the period of the loan when fragility hits?
Sure, I've seen both. I've seen both happen. But I think that's also, quite honestly, that should be the decision of the bank versus the donor or the other agency that comes in. I think also what I've seen is it can really depend on, kind of going back to the conversation earlier this morning, is it a country that's in transition or is it a country that's in active conflict or is it a country that's, has a point where they know that recovery can begin? But I think it is one thing that is important for, as I was saying earlier, is for the donor community to not just bypass the private sector banks, but to, if there is a liquidity issue, because this is always going to happen, this is no surprise, there's going to be non-performing loans, to actively work with the banks to play that role. But one thing I just wanted to say in respect to the insurance, being respectful of time, but just saying one of the things is that, well, I speak fast, so we're lucky. Is that when we talk about insurance, it's not just, it's the meso level insurance, so it's the insurance at the portfolio level for banks, but it's also really about microinsurance. And there's a huge opportunity, and a missed opportunity I see when banks or different microfinance institutions or even mobile network operators can't sell microinsurance along with savings. It's a wonderful, those are wonderful products to bundle. And I think that a lot of that goes to regulatory as well, especially when you're trying to reach financial inclusion in more rural areas, that to allow banks, microfinance institutions, and mobile network operators to also be agents for insurance companies.
Okay, thanks. The next question is really around bright spots. We've talked a lot about the challenges, but do we ever see any opportunities emerging from fragility? It sounds strange to say, but does conflict and difficulty create any opportunities, operational or strategic, for your organizations?
I have the mic. You want? Well, it's difficult. It's difficult to talk about opportunities. The only opportunities. Are you getting me? Okay. The only opportunities are situations like this, when we face those at the upper next level of the financing mechanism, that is the regional banks. When fragility occurs, they come around. But I was going to link that with what my colleague has just said here about the methodology of the regional banks, the development financiers, those who we borrow from. They are annoyingly too prolonged, and they are costly. Now, I give you an example of how long they can be. We were, Union Trust Bank were negotiating for a facility for IFC, and we had been on it for about 9 months, toing and froing, and then we had spent our meager resources, I think to the extent of about $40,000. That's a lot of money, you know. I mean, paying for their fees and all of that. But then when Ebola struck, and it lingered on for over a year, they came back and they said, no, we have to start all over again because the scenario has changed completely. And I said, I just don't have the appetite, you know, to go through all of that again. And that is an opportunity lost. So it's sort of an opportunity again, and it's an opportunity lost. So we want to use this opportunity here to appeal to our development partners to really expedite their processes, not at the expense of quality, but let's put the red tape back and provide the resources at the time they are needed. Just as we bankers, if somebody wants to borrow money and you take 6 months to appraise the loan, by the time you approve the loan, the need has gone. The market forces have changed. So you're not going to give a loan that is going to be very, very productive. So on their own side, on your own side, you guys have to be more proactive with us. Look at our situations, provide the necessary funding when it's needed, because times change and crisis and fragility enters the scene and everything else changes.
Bryce, from the investor's perspective, is there any opportunity in all this? Is the risk as high as people perceive, or does that create an opportunity for firms like yours?
I don't think that the situation in itself presents an opportunity, I guess, because people want to have a stable environment, they want to have clarity, they want to have a clear understanding of what the macro situation will be in 3 to 5 years. They want to make sure that their forecast be it for FX, for demand, are based on rock solid assumption. But I guess the response to this fragility situation present opportunities to accelerate, to involve more actively private sectors. See, in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, there's been a large public spending program where this created opportunities for banks to participate. It could be more involvement for private sector to cooperate with the government to funnel more capital into the economy. So it's really the response to the situation that presents opportunity to jump into, rather than being into a unknown situation where you don't have all the elements clear in your mind to make any decision from our standpoint.
Okay, thank you. And Groupe Banque Atlantique,
Okay.
what were the opportunities? And we're keeping people from their coffee breaks now, so if we could keep it brief, that would be brilliant. Sorry.
Mais ce que je veux indiquer, l'avantage qu'on a, je veux dire, au niveau de l'ensemble de nos régions, c'est que la plupart des pays sont sous programme du Fonds monétaire et la plupart également sont dans le processus d'amélioration de l'environnement des affaires à travers Doing Business ou bien de la possibilité de l'accès, d'avoir du soutien du gouvernement américain à travers le MCC. Donc, ce qui amène en fait les États à avoir dans les différents pays des cadres de concertation avec le secteur privé, de les impliquer en fait dans tout ce qui concerne les décisions à prendre, de nature à ce que le secteur privé soit effectivement le moteur de la croissance. Et tous ces États-là aspirent à améliorer leur attractivité et leur compétitivité à travers les places qu'ils gagnent chaque année au niveau du classement Doing Business de la Banque mondiale. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui est important. Donc, ce qui amène en fait à améliorer l'environnement économique. Donc, nous, ce que nous souhaitons en fait, c'est que on puisse continuer de promouvoir la stabilité macroéconomique dans l'ensemble de nos pays, de porter toujours une assistance technique pour l'amélioration des capacités institutionnelles des États fragiles, de renforcer la sécurité juridique en facilitant la réalisation des garanties, de réduire l'asymétrie des informations. Et ça, aujourd'hui, il y a une évolution. Tout ça grâce au Doing Business, parce qu'il y a un indicateur qui concerne l'octroi des prêts. Donc, ça veut dire que les États sont obligés de mettre en place dans leur pays des credit bureaux. Donc, c'est des credit bureaux pour que l'accès au crédit soit plus facile, pour que ça puisse réduire l'asymétrie des informations. Et puis, la création de différents fonds de garantie pour accompagner les agents économiques qui sont vulnérables et des structures d'encadrement qui vont avec. La fragilité ambiante dans nos différents pays permet également aux institutionnels, aux multinationales, de mettre en avant les ressources humaines locales. Voilà, et de travailler avec des administrateurs également locaux qui connaissent mieux ces pays, qui connaissent les spécificités en fait. Parce que, est-ce que la fragilité n'est pas une opportunité? Parce que si on dit que l'Afrique est comme on appelle, est l'avenir, est le futur, c'est parce qu'elle est fragile, c'est parce que tout est à faire au niveau de l'infrastructure, au niveau des réformes. Donc, c'est de la fragilité que part la croissance et le succès. Donc, moi, j'ai une vision optimiste des choses, comme quoi, avec des efforts qui seront faits pour améliorer la stabilité politique de nos pays, la stabilité macroéconomique et l'environnement des affaires, le business va continuer de grossir et il aura des opportunités dans nos différents pays. Donc, raison pour laquelle il ne faut pas hésiter, investir en Afrique, il faut le faire maintenant parce que l'environnement ne sera jamais calme. Vous savez, c'est comme la vie, ce n'est pas un long fleuve tranquille. Il y a des hauts et des bas, mais il faut être là maintenant. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Thea, any opportunities that you've identified through your research of crises?
Sure, I have several, but just in the sake of time, I'll just talk quickly around two.
Sure.
One is specifically, one thing I haven't really heard addressed today is around internally displaced and around refugees. The fact of the matter is there's 19 million even today in sub-Saharan Africa IDPs and refugees. And most, are living in rural or remote areas, not in camps. And, most are in, protracted displacement, meaning they're going to be where they are for minimum 3 years and up to 19 years. So I think that links back to some of the earlier comments and conversation around the need for more functional IDs, but it also offers an opportunity, especially around savings products. The UNHCR and the Swedish SIDA are actually investing in a global credit guarantee that's going to be focused on IDPs that are going to be working with private sector banks. So I think we're all really anxious to see how that moves forward. The other piece is just kind of going back to the conversation around digital finance and especially around remittances, and even taking it a little bit further and talking about diaspora funding platforms as well. The fact of the matter is that there's $40 billion a year coming into Africa from remittances, which is 50% more than that's coming in overseas development assistance. So there's also a huge opportunity for donors that maybe aren't interested in investing in individual private sector actors, but are interested in investing in sectors to really build out some of that payments infrastructure.
Thanks. I'm just taking the mood of the room. I do want to give people the opportunity to ask any burning questions if they'd like. Please put your hand up if you'd prefer to ask a question rather than go for coffee. Okay, I think that's the answer. Thank you, everybody. I thought that was very interesting, candid. Thought there was a lot of good advice for the donor and policymaking community out there, and having your boots on the ground insights about what fragility really means for a business was extremely helpful. So if everybody could give a panelist a clap. That was an excellent session. Thank you.